So if you could jump into the Nearpod, that would be fantastic. It is a code of ZVW3P. ZVW3P. So I see a few of you are joining already. That's brilliant. If the rest of you could join as well, that would be awesome. ZVW3P. Into the Nearpod we go. And today, what I would like us to look at is, well, we're going to start looking at the Phillips curve. And we are going to then be investigating another multiplier, because you can't have too many multipliers. Now I just have this vague feeling I've done this with you already, but it may be that I'm remembering last year's year 13s, so I apologize either way. Right. So we're going to be looking at this idea of a Phillips curve. Now, because we've dealt with inflation and unemployment, this is going to be another tool potentially that we can use in our analysis of economic policy with regards to inflation and unemployment. It's called the Phillips curve, which is quite handy, I guess, if your name is Philip. And in case you're wondering, this is Phillips, right? Otherwise known as Bill, right? He was a Kiwi. He's a New Zealander. He's the only New Zealander to ever have won the Nobel Prize in economics. Okay? I say New Zealander. He spent pretty much all of his life in England. All right. So, England can claim him. Right. So what has he done? He was at the London School of Economics. He has created the Phillips curve, named after him, quite clearly. And also, he created one of the world's first computers, which I may have mentioned to you already. It was called the MONIAC. Right? It was a massive, massive beast of a machine, taking up a fair size of the room. Right? He did it in 1949. There's videos and stuff online that you can find showing you the MONIAC machine and what it was like and all of those sorts of things. He ended up selling them around the world because people would use them to model their circular flow. Right? It was that idea of having pumps and levers, and the liquid moves from one to the other. So you want to increase taxes, you turn this lever, and then that liquid leaves that pool and goes into this one, and so on. And it became quite a popular tool for government economists in the late 1940s, early 1950s to use to help them with their understanding of how an economy works and to answer those what happens if sorts of questions. All right. So he sold a number of them around the world. Some countries will still have them. I know New Zealand has one still. It's in their museum. We've got a museum of the history of money in New Zealand, and it's in there. All right. I don't think Malaysia has one. There are a couple of other countries, I believe, that has them. When we were in New Zealand, we didn't get to see it. We took some students to the museum, and they were actually fixing it at the time. It was leaking like a sieve, so we couldn't actually see it. But it is there. So his contribution to economics is based around his understanding of inflation and unemployment, but also there's this idea that he created this MONIAC machine. And it's the MONIAC machine and the idea that you can model the entire macro economy through a computer, right? That was realistically what gave him his Nobel Prize in economics, right? Now, he was using UK data. There's a big reason why he's using UK data and not other countries' data, is because they've got hundreds of years of data. And what he ended up doing was he tried to work out if there was a relationship between inflation and unemployment. And if there was a relationship between the two, it was going to have some pretty big implications, as we are going to see. Right? So moving on from Bill to this, there it is, the Phillips curve, or at the very least, this is a version of it that's a little bit more modern. You'll notice I've described it as a SR, or a short-run Phillips curve, PC Phillips curve, not personal computer, not politically correct, short-run Phillips curve. Okay. Now, when you see it, you will notice straight away that the axes are a bit unusual. You've got an inflation rate on this axis, and you've got unemployment rate on that one. Now, I'm not necessarily expecting in your exam for them to ask you to draw one. However, that being said, in your paper one, there could be a question about it, or the understanding of it could then be very useful when you are discussing policy with regards to inflation or policy with regards to unemployment. Because I'm sure you can see this, but what he's actually suggesting is, because you're all rock stars, look at this, he's suggesting that there's a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. So much so that if you are actually to concentrate on, let's try and knock inflation out of the park here. Let's just try and decrease the inflation rate. Right? And so what he's suggesting is as we decrease inflation, at a certain point, we're actually going to start increasing the unemployment rate. If we then choose to focus on the unemployment rate, at a certain point, we're going to increase inflation. So he's suggesting that there is a very clear trade-off between these two, and the implications being dependent on what policy your government is wanting to, target, the evil of inflation or the evil of unemployment, you will see in the short run, at any rate, a trade-off to the other problem. Okay, so if you're targeting unemployment, you're going to see a trade-off and there will be inflation occurring. If you're targeting inflation, just because of the policies that we're using, you're going to end up seeing unemployment increase. All right. So it's a very, it's a very nice curve that's been drawn here showing that particular trade-off. Okay. So what is the short-run Phillips curve attempting to show us? There you go. If you're not keeping up with the news at the moment, you might have noticed that in America, they are desperately worried about inflation. And the latest numbers have just come out just the other day. And according to the statistics, the prices in America have risen by as much as they've risen by more than any other year outside of like 1992 or something like that. So it's been a long time since inflation was as high, potentially in America, as it is currently. They're talking about 3.8%, which is a lot higher than they want. Right. Okay, good, Sharaf. Yes, Dane, well done. You've mentioned the short run. It's very useful. Yes, well done, Arena. Yeah, that's good news, sir. Yeah, okay. Yes, Joel, it's a little bit light, but yes. Yeah, you're on the right path there, Joel. So, okay. Okay. Next, trade-off policies. Yes, okay. All right. Getting a little loose with that, but that's all right. That's okay at this point. All right, so let's have a look. So what does a modern short-run Phillips curve look like, and what happens to it? Well, if we see the short-run aggregate supply curve, if that actually shifts to the left, what we are seeing is our costs of production increase. And as we know, that's actually going to be an increase in both inflation and unemployment. So the short-run Phillips curve in that situation is actually going to move to the right. So it's going to look like this. All right. So the relationship is still there. It's just that it's now moved to the right, okay, because we've seen an increase in both inflation and unemployment. So the relationship's still there. And this is the explanation here. Just again, talking about that increase in inflation, the decrease in output. So therefore, it is what's called a less favorable trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Because where it was before was back here, all right, and now it's up here. So that relationship, that trade-off, is actually a whole lot worse than potentially it was before. And that's just because you've got the shock to aggregate supply decreasing. So what happens to the short run Phillips curve if there is an adverse shock on the short run aggregate supply curve? What happens to the short-run Phillips curve if there is an adverse, which means negative, bad, shock on short-run aggregate supply, which, you know, is obviously things that have happened in the history of the world. Good work, Arena. Well done. Oh, I just found the other cat playing amongst the paper. Yeah, that's a little light on it there, Wenhao, but yes, you're right. Yes, well done, Max. For a couple more to answer. Yeah, that's good, Darwin. We need to be a bit more precise with what we're saying here. Therefore, the graph shifts to the right. And then it says this increases unemployment rate. Yeah, you're a little bit imprecise with the language there, Darwin. Another think about that. Right, yes. Yes, well done, Sion. Yes, that's good, Joel. Yeah, again, Sharaf, a little bit imprecise. Not too bad. You're on the right path, but just a little bit imprecise. Okay. Now, it is possible to have a shift of aggregate demand, as we are aware, as well. So if aggregate demand shifts to the right, which is the example we've got here, we're going to see a decline in unemployment, potentially, but an increase in the price level. So that's actually going to be represented here by this movement along the Phillips curve, you would assume. All right? So anything that leads to a change in the price level is naturally leading to a change in inflation. Anything that increases employment and output will lead to a decrease in unemployment. So therefore, it is going to be a movement along the short-run Phillips curve. Right? So aggregate demand, when we see it move, is actually going to lead to a movement along the short-run Phillips curve. But your aggregate supply curve, particularly if it is an adverse effect, you'll see a negative effect, a shift of the short-run Phillips curve. What happens if we push the model to the extreme? What happens if we're not talking about the short run at all? What happens if we are now thinking about the long run? All right? At full employment. So that's what we've said happens in the long run. We're at full employment. Aggregate demand increases, inflation is higher, and unemployment is below its natural rate. Right? Now, in the long run, wages are flexible. Right? We've talked about how the long run is different from the short run. We've talked about how in the long run, you're going to see lots of different ideas with regards to the flexibility of the resources in particular, and wages is one aspect of that. So firms in the long run are able to reduce their employment. Now, once wages have adjusted, then unemployment's going to return, we would assume, to its natural rate. So we need to figure out what's going to happen. But first, fill in the gaps. And there we go. What do you think will happen in the long run? Good marks coming in. Now, when we used to discuss the Phillips curve, again, I know I make this comment all the time, and I apologize, under the old syllabus, right, we didn't have a lot of emphasis on the Phillips curve. It was kind of one of those sort of in the background things that you had to learn, but you didn't really have to do much with it. It is really good from an HL point of view as an HL understanding, because then when you're talking about government policies, you're able to introduce this idea of the Phillips curve into your analysis. So then it becomes what, the skill of synthesis, the idea of bringing in this model, this term, into your discussion, right? And it allows you to be perhaps a little bit more critical with your thinking about government policy. Okay, all right. So what we would have seen is that at full employment, when aggregate demand increases, inflation is higher than what is desired, and unemployment is therefore below its natural rate. In the long run, wages are going to be flexible, so higher wages ultimately will cause firms to reduce employment. In the long run, once wages have then adjusted, unemployment is going to return to its natural rate. So what will happen? Dum, 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 big reveal. We have a long run Phillips curve, which looks, ta-da, just like that. All right, there it is. All right, now, long run Phillips curve is here. It is actually at that idea of the natural rate, which we've dealt with before because we've talked about the natural rate of unemployment before. When we imagine the long run, okay, and we're going to see potentially higher inflation forcing workers to demand higher wages, right, reducing the levels of employment. But as we said, our economy is going to adjust back to the natural rate. So therefore, what we're now linking is we're linking the idea of unemployment to the idea of inflation in the long run. So this curve is no longer just the natural rate of unemployment, it is also the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, or NAIRU. Oh, fantastic. Isn't that an amazing, cool name, right? It does sound a little bit Maori, but it isn't, right? And what we then say is this level then takes on, the natural rate of unemployment then takes on a lot more significance because it is also the level where we are going to see a level of inflation that is basically a natural level of inflation as well. So targeting the long run is what we're going to be wanting to do with our government policies. What was the long run Phillips curve then all about? You go put some clothes on. Okay. Good. Well done, Joel. Yes, well done, Fatima. That's very well explained. Waiting on the rest. Have a go, team. Yes, well done, Max. Okay. Waiting on a couple more. Yes, indeed. Okay, you're getting it. Well done. Waiting on another couple. Okay. So the long run Phillips curve then becomes part of our policy thought process. And as it does, what we need to think about is the implications of it. So basically, in the long run, if we are taking the long run Phillips curve at face value, there will be no trade-off between unemployment and inflation at the long run Phillips curve. So your unemployment is going to return to its natural rate regardless of whatever the rate is for inflation. Now, therefore, if there is a decline in aggregate demand, unemployment is going to be greater, right, than the natural rate of unemployment. So in the long run, workers are going to accept lower wages. The economy will self-correct. Now, that's an idea from neoclassical thinking, right? So not classical thinking in this context, neoclassical, where the word neo means new, right? Which is a little ironic because you're talking about a new classical thought, but that's how it's now labeled. You've also got neo-Keynesians, you've also got post-Keynesians, and you've also got neo-post-Keynesians, right? But you don't need to worry about them at this point, okay? Right? At full employment, we've got stable level inflation. So again, it becomes, maybe this is our target. Maybe this is the panacea that we've been waiting for, the goal, the objective. This is what we can focus our economy towards. When are we going to get it is the next question. And you remember we talked about a very famous economist saying or suggesting to us that in the long run, we were all dead. Maybe we should be focusing on the short run. No, skip through that. In the long run, it may be possible to reduce the natural rate of unemployment. And this is part of those supply side policies that we've hinted at before, because those supply side policies are going to have an impact on the macro model aggregate supply, right? So therefore, all of that is going to have an impact on the natural rate of unemployment, education, training, unemployment benefits, the infrastructure spending, all of that potentially could help with that natural rate of unemployment. And yeah, I've said about finding evidence of that in real life, and that's part of this link to your work on supply side economics, supply side policies. Now this, what do you think? Okay, I'm just going to stop sharing just for a minute. We're going to jump back to the meat. What do those? Oh, Sariha's here. I think. Are you?
Yeah.
Yay! I get to mark you present. That's an exciting thing to do. All right. So back to here. So you saw those two images. They're still up in the class in the Nearpod. All right. Going to come back to them in a second. Have a look at those. What am I attempting to say there? What is it that you see? All right, you can put it in the chat or you can turn on your mic and tell me, but what is it these diagrams are telling you? What are they showing you? What do you think? Is it a little scary? Not scary in a mathematical sense or anything like that. It's just a little scary theoretical scariness, not horror movie scariness or anything. Oh, interesting. Well done, Fatima. You're thinking. You're absolutely thinking right. What do you think? What is it I'm attempting to show with those two models? Another couple of seconds. Have a thought. This isn't something that Dr. Google is going to be able to help you with. To be honest, they look like the artwork that Harley John used to produce. It's an idea. It's an idea. Oh, hold on. Gosh, Sharif, that's a good answer. Well done, Sharif. You are absolutely on the right path. Let's have another look at those models and see what we can see. Yeah, you're absolutely right. These models that we've illustrated here are our attempts to model the real world. All right. So we've got a theoretical construct that our friend Bill Phillips created of short-run Phillips curve. There we go. Okay, but what does the real world look like? Like that. So when you actually plot real-world data, this is what real-world data looks like for inflation and unemployment. Or this. So the question then has really baffled a lot of economists over time, and there's been, the number of articles that have come out have just been incredible, but asking whether there is any relationship at all between inflation and unemployment. Because if you look at it, look, yeah, well, look, this one. All right. So it's like those diagrams that you used to see, like the sort of the illusion diagrams. We have to kind of squint your eyes really tightly to try and see where the pattern actually is. Or maybe you have to do some really advanced mathematical linear regression to try and figure out where the pattern is. Right? And oh no, this one's deviated too far from the line, so therefore we discount that. Well, how much of this are you actually just ignoring? How much of reality are you ignoring? And this is, a little bit personal to me, because this is what I did my thesis in, the short-run Phillips curve, and whether it was possible to model it in a real-life situation. And yeah, to be perfectly honest, I found that the theory works really well, and then when you try and apply it to real life, this is exactly what happens. So real life is a whole lot more complicated, right? I mean, just think. Right? When did Bill Phillips produce this work? Well, it was produced in the 1940s, 1950s. Well, what's happened since then? You consider the world that roared in the 1960s, and then you had the 1970s with a massive inflation price shock. Then you had the 1980s, the roaring 1980s. Then you had the massive collapse of the economies around the world at the end of the 1980s. Then you had the roaring 1990s. Then you had the collapse of them in the early 2000s with the technology. So this is what's been happening. You've got periods of time that kind of look a little bit like what we're thinking. And maybe you can make a trace and then say over time, the bulk of the data has shifted. Maybe that's an indication of inflation. All right, an adverse shock here, maybe. But what we tend to find is this. We tend to find that the data it's a lot harder to map the data to the relationship that Bill Phillips found with modern information than we think. Right? And we honestly have come up with linear regression models to attempt to do this, and they're really complicated. Right? You have to exclude a huge number of variables just to get relatively close. Right? You have to take all these assumptions. We're assuming this and assuming that, and just to get something that looks relatively close. So there are some people who say that the Phillips curve is dead, that the model doesn't work. Right? Or maybe it worked back then, but doesn't work now. And so there are some economists who will say, yes, it still works. You've just got to look at it from the right angle, right? And ignoring a whole lot of other data. Right? And then there are other people who say, well, if you're ignoring all of this data, then it doesn't work. So it is very much a good old TOK moment. It is a theory that in the past used to fit. The reality now is we're not 100% sure that it does. But it is a very useful tool for a government when they are considering macroeconomic policy. So should we get rid of it entirely? Or is the thought process surrounding it enough? Or do we need the hard data? Right? So rule as a one, the Phillips curve. Now, these have come up now. These are based again on the old syllabus, and they aren't necessarily, they're a little clumsy, right? But we'll go through it. Explain how the theory of the Phillips curve, can be used to explain why it is often thought that a low level of unemployment makes an inflationary outburst inevitable. And that's only 10 marks there, so that's very clumsily written, all right? So a more likely sort of part of that is just to explain the Phillips curve in the context of inflation and unemployment, right? And therefore you're dealing with the short run, the long run, the definitions for unemployment, the definitions for inflation, right? Connecting the relationship, the trade-off idea, and then examine the view that each country has a natural rate of unemployment and that it will always return to it in the long run. So that idea of always return to it, right? Can a natural rate of unemployment be changed and how? So that's the supply side, right, of the economy, right, and there. Now, one of the things, this is one of the main reasons why I'm really, I don't know, I'm feeling a bit more weighted towards the Phillips curve, probably more than I did under the old syllabus. And the reasoning being is that there's been a lot of chatter online amongst economics teachers about the new syllabus. And one of the things that we are now starting to think will happen is that we are starting to think that that idea of synergy, that skill of synergy, is going to be really important going forwards. Right? And part of that is the linking. So with the Phillips curve, we're obviously linking inflation and unemployment. So therefore, it is a really good tool to have in your toolbox when you are attempting to explain government policy to do with inflation or government policy to do with unemployment. So even if the question isn't directly related to the Phillips curve, you still should be able to use it in an answer if it is discussing the idea of inflation or unemployment. And the other chatter that's been around is that they are suggesting that the questions are going to become more along the lines of this, where you are having two objectives in the same question to analyze, right? As opposed to in the past when we were just analyze unemployment or just analyze inflation. And again, that then gives you room to introduce the Phillips curve and the relationship idea or the trade-off idea. Right? So that's why I am now leaning more towards it as being a really awesome tool, even though there's all those assumptions as well. All of the ideas that we've just said about whether it actually works in reality. Right? That is critical thinking. So that is quite a good thing for you to have again in your toolbox. Now, right, next little bit is the Keynesian multiplier. Now, the other day we worked on a credit creation multiplier, otherwise known as a money multiplier. I'd like to have a look at the Keynesian multiplier. Now, again, I'm struggling to remember if I've actually gone through the Keynesian multiplier with you already. Can I just have a confirmation? Have I stopped sharing? Still. Have I done the Keynesian multiplier with you already?
I don't think so.
Don't think so? Nope. Awesome. I didn't think I had. It's just because I have a memory, that goes back a little way. I was thinking I had. Right. So Keynesian multiplier. Now, this is the same basic principle that we looked at with regards to the money multiplier, but now it's going to be addressed in a slightly different way. So now when we're thinking about economic growth, when we think about policies that are going to cause economic growth, one of the key questions we're going to be thinking about is how big will that change end up being in GDP? So how dramatic an effect, because we've got an objective of increasing economic growth. right? Or we've got an objective of decreasing unemployment, and one of the tools that we're going to use is going to be a fiscal expansion tool. Well, how big will that change on the overall economy be? All right? And here's how we work it. Now, it's Keynesian, so it's not classical. And what he suggested is that any increase in CIGNX is going to lead to an increase in GDP. However, the final value for GDP is actually going to be bigger than the initial increase in expenditure. Why? Now, you've got a big hint with this with regards to the money or the credit creation multiplier that we talked about the other day. Why will the final value for GDP be bigger? What do you think? Surely if you increase C, it just means that GDP is bigger. No? Why is it going to be bigger than the initial increase? Inflation, that's an idea. Yeah. Are there other ideas? Yes, we are. It's a multiplier. We're multiplying it. Why would we be multiplying it? Don't worry, I can't spell either. Economic growth, possibly. Yes, indeed. What happens when you go to the shop to buy something? All right, how do you pay for it? Yes, you're absolutely right, Joel. It's exactly like the money multiplier. Yeah, you pay for it maybe with your debit card. Yeah, and then that money then becomes income for that retailer. Okay, so it was your consumption spending, but now it becomes income for someone else. And what do they do with it? Potentially go and spend it. Yeah. And then it becomes income for someone else. And then they go and spend it. And then it becomes income for someone else. And then they go and spend it. So although you might be, say you're increasing government spending by $100 million, right? Or in the case of the US, $2 trillion, $4 trillion, however much it's going to end up being, it's actually going to, the final result is actually going to be a multiple of that amount. And that's not taking, we're not taking into account the money multiplier, that's separate. So that's going to be another increase. Hence why economists have, in America's case in particular, been quite concerned about the overall effect that these sorts of policies might actually have on inflation. All right, so let's have a look at what the Neuropod says. All right. Here it is, the expenditure multiplier, the Keynesian multiplier, or otherwise known as the expenditure multiplier. Either of those two terms are, well, they're synonymous with each other, all right? They're the same thing. The expenditure multiplier is the idea that not only does spending affect the equilibrium level of GDP, but that it means a change in spending causes a more than proportionate change in GDP. All right, here's how it works. You've got a change in your real GDP, and you're going to divide it by the initial change in your expenditure. And that should give you the multiplier, which is, that should be relatively straightforward. Now, again, these are equations that you aren't going to be given. These are ones that you are, unfortunately, just going to have to remember. All right, so let's take an example here. So if the change in real GDP was 5, let's do a whiteboard. So the change in real GDP, so this is the total change was 500, where'd the 5 go? All right, 500. And the initial increase was 100. What's the multiplier?
5.
5. So you've got a multiplication factor of 5, and that's literally all that it is. All right? You work out how much the change has been. GDP's increased by this much. How much was the initial change? This much. So the multiplier is this. Now, they may tell you that multiplier, right? Because that's the other way they can do it. They could say, if the multiplier is 5 and the initial increase is 100, what is the final result? All right. Now, that's, again, remember, you've got paper 2 and paper 3 where there are some calculations involved. So that could fit within that, or it could be just in your analysis, your understanding of what's actually happening. And you're explaining that if they do increase the fiscal expansion by $100 billion, $100 million, $100 billion, $1 trillion, who knows, then by multiplying it by 5, the total or end result of GDP is going to be much bigger. All right. However, as we know, not everybody is going to spend all of their extra income. Some people, when they get money, they actually put it into their bank account as savings, which obviously then goes through the money market and the money market multiplier. Right? So they put that into their savings, so it actually leaks out of the circular flow, CF, circular flow. We can work out how much of your extra income earned is likely to be saved or spent. And the way we do that is by working out something called a marginal propensity to consume. All right, so let's imagine in our imaginingness that you have, delete that, yes, you have $100. All right, there's your money. Woohoo! Okay, now let's imagine that you are going to save some of that and not spend all of it. You might save 80%, therefore saving 20%. So that then becomes your consumption, and that then becomes your saving. So the proportion of your income that you consume is your marginal proportion, marginal propensity to consume. The proportion that you save is going to be your marginal propensity to save. And we're going to use these sort of statistics as an average, and we're going to say that this is what you do all the time. And yes, it's quite probably going to be wrong, but this is what we say. If you have this propensity to consume 80% of your income, that you're always going to consume 80% of your income. So no matter what, if you earned $1, then you would be consuming 80 cents of it. And what would be left over would be the 20 cents that you would be saving. So 1 equals MPC plus MES. It is going to get a slightly amount more complicated than that in a minute, but that's all right. You can cope. All right. So if you earn that much, if you're consuming that much, saving that much, that's your, excuse me, these are your propensities here. And we're going to use that. So we're going to say if the economy increases by 100 million, 100 billion, right, then 80% of that is going to be the next round of consumption, right, which then becomes someone's income. So the next person gets 80. And maybe they save 10% of it. Okay. Oops. Anyway, I've got to run the other way. Maybe they save 10% of it and consume 90% of it. So their MPC and MPS is 0.9 plus 0.1. All right, and then it goes to the next person, and the next person, and the next person. So the next person, oh, that's 71. Yeah. 72. All right. So the next person gets $72 worth of income, and then they might choose to save a certain amount and consume a certain amount of that. And this savings then becomes an income for the bank, which then goes through the credit multiplication process, because they will be loaning out a certain amount of that money. All right? Is that okay? Are your brains melting? I'm hoping not. We're all right?
Surviving.
Surviving? Good. Okay. Okay. Yes, this would be easier in class, but that's all right. No problems. Right. So our equation, therefore, becomes about your marginal propensities. So as some of your additional income is earned is also taxed, then we need to take out your tax. Right? Some of your income you spend on imports, then we need to take out your import spending. So we've got marginal propensity to consume, we've got marginal propensity to tax, we've also got marginal propensity to import, and we've got marginal propensity to save. So what we're going to do is we're going to add them all together. We're going to go marginal propensity to consume plus marginal propensity to tax plus marginal propensity to import plus marginal propensity to save. And what if you add them all together, what number do you get? MPC plus MPM plus MPT. What do you get? You add them all together. 1. Absolutely right. Yeah, it has to be 1 because 1 is 100% of your income. All right, so therefore it must all equal 1. All right, now I know this is a little bit of maths and that's a bit scary to be doing on a Friday morning, but you know, there's no real other way to do it, I don't think. So here you've got a slightly different situation. Here you've got an initial increase in the economy, a fiscal expansion of $8 million. Now, we can imagine that there will be a whole lot of changes here. Income for this person is this much, income for that person is this much, and so on and so on and so on and so on. And eventually, the final outcome is 32 million. So what's the multiplier? 8 and 32. 8 is the initial amount of money, 32 is the end, so the multiplier is 4. Absolutely right. That's it. That's how complicated that bit is. Right? Now, it may be that you get a table and you have to work out the multiplier, okay, particularly if it's paper 2 we're thinking of. It may be that you're given the multiplier and you have to work out the end number, right? All of those sorts of ideas are possible. Well done. Yes, absolutely. 4. Much less scary than you first thought. All right, so here's the scary bit. All right, the larger your propensity to consume, the smaller the denominator, so the larger the multiplier, right? Because this marginal propensity to consume, if you're now thinking 80%, 90%, 95%, then you are consuming more, so therefore there's more income going back into the economy, and that is greater levels of income to go to the next person, and so on and so forth. So the multiplier is actually larger, all right? So the equation that we can use is this one, and it is 1 divided by 1 minus the MPC. So if your MPC, if you are consuming 80% of your income, and use this equation, you're consuming 80% of your income, so what's the multiplier? If 1 over 1 minus the MPC is the equation that we use to get the multiplier, and you're consuming 80% of your income, what's the multiplier? 5. Well done. Yes, absolutely right. Okay, because you had 1 divided by 1 minus and that should equal 5. Now, you can also probably, because you guys are all mathematicians, you're much better mathematicians than I would have been at your age. So you can probably see that 1 minus the MPC is exactly the same as 1 divided by MPS, right? Because remember, 1 equals MPC plus MPS. But of course, we're also going to need to add in the NPM and the NPT, because we lose that. Now, they might be 0, right, potentially. So then it's just 1 over the MPS. Okay. Right, now, as said, this sort of equation is not given to you in an exam. And if you are asked to do the calculation, then it's more likely that it'll be a paper 2, maybe a paper 3, because this is higher level, so they might throw it into a paper 3. It could be that it's a table and there are numbers and you need to calculate it from the table. There's all sorts of different approaches. Okay. Or it could just be simply using the equation and figuring it out. What was the equation for the Keynesian multiplier again? Yep, so that's going to get you the amount. Yes, indeed. That'll get it to you. Or we'll use this equation here. Well done, Sharaf. All right, so Keynesian multiplier, 1 over 1 minus the MPC, or an alternative way to look at it is 1 over the MPS plus the MPM plus the MPT. Well done. Absolutely right. Okay. Yeah, okay, Nisa, we need to have what we think. Yeah, Joel, okay, yes, that is true as a statement. That isn't going to get you the Keynesian multiplier, but that is actually true as a statement. Yes, Seon, you're absolutely right. Okay. All right, now team, let's move on. If we have a positive multiplier, so if the number is positive, then after we've got an initial increase in our injection, right, it should lead to a greater final increase in real GDP. But it is possible to have a negative multiplier. If the economy is actually shrinking, then it is possible to have a greater final decrease in the real GDP as well. And that would be a negative multiplier. So as much as the economy can grow through this multiplication process, it can also shrink through a multiplication process as well. Now I put some information here about what will affect the value of the multiplier. It's a little mathematical. It's because you're talking about the actual level of expectations in the economy. You're talking about the understanding of your marginal propensity to consume, right? So if the multiplier is high, if it is big, then the economy's got plenty of spare capacity and your propensity to tax and import is actually low, potentially, or you could assume that there's a high propensity to consume, and that will get you, again, that high multiplier value. The reverse is going to be true if it's a small multiplier number. You're close to your capacity limits, excuse me. There's more demand, which potentially leads to more inflation. There's a smaller propensity to consume, and there's maybe rising interest costs with that. Now, economists at the IMF have calculated that a long-run multiplier value of 1.5 is true for most developed countries and 1.6 for most developing countries. So we actually attempt to use these ideas. And yet you can make there's an awful lot of assumptions within it. I mean, your marginal propensity to consume, it's an average across everybody. How can that possibly be? Right? How can you say everybody has the same marginal propensity to consume? How are you going to reconcile that with the people who spend more than they earn? Right? What happens then? So there are a lot of critical thoughts that can be leveled at this idea of a Keynesian multiplier. I'm going to skip past that because that's going to confuse you. Now, if we invest in the economy, we increase fiscal expansion by $8 billion, and the multiplier is 1/1 minus the MPC. The MPC is 3/4 or 0.75. What is the total level of GDP? So 8 billion, MPC is 0.75. What's the total value? What's happened? What's the multiplied amount? 8 billion increase and 0.75 is the MPC. So what is the amount? How much is the economy multiplied by? Yeah, well done. It actually works out to be the same as the example before. Absolutely right. Wenhao, well done. Math magician. Yeah, it's times by 4. Absolutely. Okay. Now that might be something that you need to practice, team. Now, obviously the lesson is being recorded, so you can access that. For the multiplier to have the greatest effect, the price level needs to be constant. If it is not constant, then you're going to have some problems with it, all right? And because we talked about that capacity idea, the multiplier is actually going to be different depending on which section of your Keynesian aggregate supply curve you look at. All right, and there's a bit of an explainer there about the idea of aggregate expenditure versus GDP. That expenditure is our planning and GDP is our actual. So depending on what you look at in your exam, it just makes a slight change in your understanding there. Okay, team. All ready with that? That all okay? Are there any particular questions?
No.
No? Fantastic. So what I'd like you to do, I've used up slightly more of the time than I wanted to, but that's okay. I will post the recording to the lesson up, and yeah, I'd like you to work on your IAC2, but yes, you will be needing to review the material, right, this one, right, making sure that you understand the Phillips curve, how it can possibly be used, and also the MPC, and how it can be used in the context of a multiplying amount for Keynesian expansion. All right, team? As we'd say in the land of my birth, He Kōnera, which means goodbye for now. Thank you. See you.
Thank you, David.
Thank you. Have a good weekend.
You too. Oops. Need to do this first.